I'm going to change these. So these are going to be like the titles, or the titles of each column for our table. So I could say like num1, num2, and num3. So basically they have to list out 3 numbers. And you'll see here that these are now like specified in bold. So these would be like, you know, the different column titles, and then here we have the information for each column. One of the other things about tables is that they're really flexible. So if I wanted to come over here and add in another column to the table, all I'd have to do is just copy this guy, and we can just put in another table data entry. So we could say like 3.5. And so now, in addition to this 3, we're also going to have another entry in the table. But we don't have to have entries for like these table headers or for this other guy. You can just put whatever entries you want. And the other cool thing about tables is that they'll resize themselves. So as I make this window smaller, you'll see that the text inside of this table is like wrapping around, and that's kind of cool. So you can compress the table and you'll still have all this information, and you can see that the information below it is actually moving down to accommodate it. So tables are actually really responsive. So you can define as many table rows and as much table data as you want. And there's actually another thing we can do, which is add in a caption. So the caption will be like the overall title of the table. So right here underneath the table tag, I'm gonna put these caption tags. And again, this is like the title of the table. So we could just say like list of numbers. And now this table will have a nice caption on it. So you can see the caption will sit like right in the middle, right above the table. And a lot of times what people will do is they'll make this like a header. So you can make this a header 2. And now it'll be like this nice big title for our table. So it looks really good. So that's the basics of using a table. Another thing that people like to do is define a table head and a table body. And this is just makes it easier for people to read through the tables in the HTML. So for example, right now it's like not super obvious that this is supposed to be the table heading, and it's not super obvious that this is supposed to be like the content of the table. So you can separate the 2 sections by specifying a table head and a table body. So up here, right underneath actually right before this caption, we're gonna define the table head. So I'm just gonna say T head. And then below here, I'm just gonna end this. And now I'll just sort of indent this so it looks a little bit better. So this is gonna be all the information in the header of the table. Now we can create another tag called a table body, and it's gonna be the same thing. I'm just gonna say T body, and then we'll end the T body down here at the bottom of the table. And again, I'm just gonna kind of indent these things so it's easier to see. So now our table is laid out with a head and a body, and you'll see that it doesn't change the way the table looks, but it just allows us to format it and organize it a little bit better. Now there's one more thing that we can do with tables, which is control something called call span. And call span stands for column span. So for example, I have this one right here, right? And this is in the table. You'll notice that when we look at the table, 1 takes up exactly 1 column in the table, right? So it's taking up 1 column, and then in the second column we have 2 and then 3. But I can actually have 1 take up more than 1 column. So I can come over here in the table data and I can say call span is equal to, and inside of these quotation marks I can just put an integer number. So I could say, for example, 2. And now this piece of table data is going to take up 2 columns in the table. So you'll see right now it's taking up 1. When I refresh the page, it's taking up 2 now. So this 1 entry takes up 2 columns in the table, and then everything else gets pushed over to the side. So I could also say like 3, and now this will take up 3 columns, just like that. So you can control how many columns each individual table data is going to take up, and that really allows you to control like every aspect of your table. So that's the basics of using tables. I mean, you want to just make sure that you're using the right tags. I mean, tables, at least for me, have always been like kind of daunting because there's so many of these like little tags in there, but as long as you keep them well indented and you keep them organized, then you should have no problem. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about containers in HTML. Now, a container in HTML is basically a set of tags that wraps other HTML elements. So I can define a starting and an ending tag, and then inside of those tags, I'll just put a bunch of other HTML elements. Now, generally, when you're writing HTML, it's good to wrap your HTML tags in what we would call like a wrapper tag. And that's basically just like a set of tags that sort of stores all of the HTML. And that's because when you start getting into more advanced HTML and you're looking at things like CSS, which is basically just a language that you can use to style your web pages, usually if you want to apply a certain styling to a bunch of different elements, you can just apply it to that wrapper element and all of the elements inside of it will inherit that style. I don't want to get too into like CSS and styling, but just know that a lot of times in HTML, it's good to wrap up a bunch of elements into a like overall container. And in this lesson, I want to talk to you guys about two of the most popular containers in HTML, which are divs and spans. And those are both sets of HTML tags that you can use as containers. You can put a bunch of different HTML elements inside of a div or a span, and then you're sort of like wrapping them up. Before I get into divs and spans, I want to talk to you guys about the different ways that HTML elements are displayed. And this is kind of an important concept for you guys to understand the difference between a div and a span. And this is also just an important concept in general when we're talking about HTML. So HTML has two basic ways that it displays elements. And keep in mind, there's more than two. You can get into a bunch of different other ones, but the two main ways, like the two ways that you need to know if you want to know HTML are block and inline. So CSS can display what are called block elements, and it can display inline elements. Now, block elements are CSS or HTML elements that take up the entire width of the page. So they're just like a block on the page. And inline elements are elements that only take up as much space as they need. So you could have inline elements like sitting right next to each other, but you couldn't have block elements sitting right next to each other because the block elements take up the entire width of the page. Now, different HTML tags are going to display differently. So some tags are block tags. Other tags are inline tags. A good example of this is paragraphs versus links. So if I was to create two links inside of HTML, I can just make a link, and it doesn't really have to link to anything. It doesn't really matter. And I'll just say link 1, and I'll make another link down here. I'm just going to copy this one, and we'll call this link 2. When I refresh my page, you'll see over here that these links are actually sitting right next to each other. So link 1 is sitting right next to link 2. And this is a good example of two inline elements. So these links are able to sit next to each other because they're only taking up as much space on the page as they need, right? Link 1 only needs this amount of space, so it only takes up that much space. If I made the text in link 1 longer, now it's going to have to take up more space, but you can see we can still stick link 2 here right next to it. These are, like I said, inline CSS elements, so they can sit in line with each other, or they can sit on the same line is a good analogy. And now I'm going to create two HTML paragraphs. So an HTML paragraph is a good example of a block element. So I'm just going to make one paragraph, and then I'm going to make another paragraph down here. And I'm actually going to separate these. So what you'll notice is, unlike these links, how they sat next to each other, these two paragraphs aren't going to be able to do that. So you can see we have paragraph 1 up here. And even though there's enough room up here in this file to put paragraph 2, it's not going to go there, right? So it doesn't matter how small I make paragraph 1. Like, it doesn't matter how much room there is over here for paragraph 2 to go. It's never going to go over there because these are block elements. So block elements, like I said, they take up the entire width of the page, and so they force the next element to go below them. These inline elements don't do that. So with these inline elements, you can just store them right next to each other in the file. And that's the difference between the two main display types in HTML, block display and inline display. As long as you understand that concept, the concept of a block element and the concept of an inline element, then you're going to understand what spans and divs are used for. So the big difference between spans and divs is that spans are inline containers and divs are block containers. So I can create a span, and you just do it by making these span tags. And we can make an end one, and I can just put some text inside of here. So let's just say span 1, and then I'll make another span down here, span 2. And what you'll notice is when I refresh the page, these two spans, in other words, the elements or the text inside of these two spans is displayed right next to each other, right? So this span is an inline container. When I make two divs, I'm going to make div, and I'll do the same thing. So we'll just put some text in here. We can just say div1 and div2. And now when I refresh the page, you'll notice that these divs are on different lines. So unlike those spans, which are inline elements, these divs are block elements. So the divs can't be on the same line because they're blocks. So div1 is taking up the entire width of the screen. But these spans can because they're inline. So that's the big difference between divs and spans, is that divs are inline, or no, divs are block elements and spans are inline elements. And these are both containers. So we can use spans and divs as containers, right? So these are gonna hold either text or they're gonna hold like other HTML elements. When you start getting into CSS, which is how you style HTML, you can actually apply styling to these spans as well. So that's another reason why you might use a span. Divs are containers as well, but divs are block elements. So anything you put inside a div is gonna be like a block element on the page. So that's the basic use for divs and spans. You're gonna see these used a lot. I think probably divs are used a little bit more than spans are, just because the circumstances for using spans are a little bit more specific than for divs. Generally, if you're defining a like overall container in HTML, you just wanna use a div. And a lot of times if you see people using containers in HTML, they're gonna wrap stuff in a div. So just remember that a div is a block element. So anything that goes inside of a div is gonna take up the whole width of the screen, right? That div container itself is gonna take up the width because it's a block element. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using input tags in HTML. Now, input tags are basically going to allow you to add elements on your page where users can input information. So these are things like text boxes or text areas or checkboxes, radio buttons, all sorts of elements on the site that users can interact with to enter information. Now, here's the catch. When you're defining these elements in HTML, we're not actually making them functional. So if I define like a text box on my website, just because I define it in HTML doesn't mean that it's gonna work. In other words, just because you have the text box there doesn't mean someone's gonna be able to type in information and you'll be able to do stuff with that. In order to like get information from a user through these text boxes, you need to use a language called JavaScript. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. We're just trying to learn HTML. So I'm just gonna show you guys the actual HTML elements that you can use to define these things like text boxes and text areas. And then if you want, you can go off and learn JavaScript and you can learn how to get input from them. So down here, I'm gonna define my first input, and all the inputs for the most part are gonna use the same tag. So they're gonna use this input tag. So I can just say input, and I need to pass this a HTML attribute. So I need to give it some information. We can say type, and I need to tell it what type of input I want to accept. And there's a long list of different types of inputs that you can accept in HTML, but the most basic one is just text. So this will basically create a text box for us. And you notice that the input is only one tag. It's like a single tag. So we're just ending it over here. There's not like another tag, another ending tag. When I refresh my page, you'll see that we have this text box up here, and I can actually just start typing in whatever I want inside of here, and it's gonna be a functional text box. Another thing I can do is create a text box for a password. So something that is really common on websites is to have the user enter a password. And what you can do is you can actually hide the text that's getting input into the text box. So instead of saying type text, we can say type password. And you'll see what happens when I come up here I can type normally in this text box, but when I type down here, it covers these things up. So now they're just like little dots and you can't actually see what's being typed inside of there. So that's kind of like a HTML way of hiding the input from a text box. Another thing we can do is define default content inside of these text boxes. So I could give this a value attribute, and now we can just define a default value. So I could say like, enter your username. Maybe this is like a username prompt. And now you'll see that this text is automatically included inside of that text box without me having to do anything. Now I can also define something called a text area. And a text area is a lot like an input, but instead of just having one single line, we can have like a huge block where we can enter text. So this isn't technically an input tag, it has its own type of tag. So it's just called text area. And in here, we can make two tags. So we're also gonna need a closing tag. And this text area, you'll see, is gonna be like a big thing that we can put our text in. So unlike these two blocks right here, this text area is a little bit bigger, and we can actually resize it. So I could take this text area and make it a lot bigger on my page, just like that. And then I can, type in whatever I wanted into here, and that would basically be a place for me to enter in lots of text. You can also define some attributes for a text area. So I can give this a specified number of rows or columns. So I could say here, rows is equal to, and now we could say like, maybe we want it to be like 10 rows, and we could say columns. So remember, rows are going down, columns are going across. So we can say columns, and why don't we make this like 30 so it's really obvious. And now this text area is gonna be really big, just like that. So it's 30 columns across and 10 rows down. And you can kind of just like see how that works there. And you can also define default text for a text area. So inside of these two text area tags, I could just type, enter a paragraph, and now that text is gonna be in there by default. So that's the text area field, and that's pretty fun. There's a couple other input tags that we can look at. So there's different types of input that you can accept. And I'm just gonna get rid of this value actually. In addition to accepting things like text, we can also accept something like a date. So a lot of times you might have someone like enter their birthday or something, and you can see now the browser is displaying like this little date input for us, and you get this little calendar widget. And this is gonna look different on different browsers, but for the most part, if you use this input type, you can control like what the user is gonna input. So in addition to date, we could also do like email, and email is actually pretty similar to just the text box. We could also do like a range. So this could be like a range of numbers, and you can see we have this little slider here. We could also do a file. So a lot of times on websites, you want users to upload a file, and you'll see that this actually opens up my little file browser here. And I can click open, and it'll like grab the name of the file. And obviously, without JavaScript or another programming language, you can't actually upload these files. But the point is, you can give the actual input prompt for these files. And you can also define different types of buttons. So I can define like a checkbox, and here we just have a little box that we could check. You could also define a radio button. Actually, I want to show you guys the difference between checkboxes and radio buttons. So if I have two checkboxes, I can check both of them at the same time. Okay, just like that. If I have two radio buttons though, and if I give them an attribute called name, so we can name radio button, so I could say button, and we'll give this one that same exact name, you can actually only click on one of these radio buttons at a time. So if they have the same name, then I can only click one at a time. So checkboxes, you can click as many as you want. With radio buttons though, as long as they have the same name, you can only check one at a time. We can also define different buttons. So I could define like a submit button. That's kind of a popular button that people have. So if you have a form, like an HTML form, you can define a submit button. So I can just say submit, and now we'll get this nice little button here for submitting. So there's actually a bunch of these different input types, and I have this web page open over here. This is a web page on W3 Schools, And it basically just defines all of the input types for HTML. So the address is w3schools.com/tags/att_input_type. And down here, there's this really good list, and it just lists out all of the different types of inputs that you can have. So you see like button, checkbox, color, date, file, text, URL, all of these different, types of like text boxes or buttons or little elements that you can use to input information in HTML. So I want to talk to you guys about one more HTML element, which is called a form. And a form is basically an element that is going to be used to store all of these inputs generally. So generally, if you see people using this form element, they're going to be putting these input tags inside of here. So a form is like a wrapper for a bunch of user input. And as I was saying before, like when you really want to like accept input from a user, you're gonna need another language besides HTML, and that's usually where forms are gonna come in handy, because forms can like give information to like your web server or whatever. But you don't really have to worry about that right now. Just know that a form tag is a lot of times acts as a wrapper for these different input tags. So hopefully you guys, got something out of that. You can kind of got a little bit of an introduction into these different input tags, and now you can style your website so users can input information into it. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you about using iframes in HTML. An iframe is an HTML element that's actually able to display another website inside of your web page. So you can effectively embed an entirely different website inside of your own web page, which is pretty cool. So you can create an iframe tag pretty much anywhere in your site, and it's just iframe like that, and then we need to pass this one attribute, which is a source. And this is going to be like the website that you want to embed. So in my case, why don't we just do the Draft Academy website. And then I can close off this iframe tag. And you're also going to need a closing iframe tag. So you're going to need one over here. And now inside of these iframe tags, you can put some text. And this is text that's going to get displayed if the user that's on your website can't view iframes. So maybe their browser just like doesn't support iframes, or maybe they, have some option toggled where it doesn't view iframes. Basically, this code would be displayed to them if they can't view it. So now when I head over here, I can refresh this page, and you'll notice that inside this little window, the Draft Academy homepage is displaying, but it's like super small. So if you want, you can come down here and we can resize these iframes. So I can give this a width attribute, and we'll just make it 1,000. And I can also give it a height attribute, and we can make this like 800. So now this iframe should display a lot bigger, right? So now I can see the whole website. And so this website is literally embedded inside of my website. So I can go to all the different pages of the website. It works just like a normal website would, but it's inside of our website. So another thing you can do is you can control the border. So if you look here on this iframe, you can see there's like a little border around here. It's like this little gray bar. It's kind of hard to see. But if you want to get rid of that, there's another attribute we can pass in. We can just say frame border is equal to 0. And now this will get rid of that little border. So the iframe will just be like even more embedded inside of the website. Now iframes are really great, and you can pretty much use an iframe for any website. But one thing that a lot of websites will do, a lot of like big websites, is they'll prevent other websites from using their websites as iframes. So like if I tried to make this iframe for like Amazon, for example, Amazon.com, then when I refresh the page, you'll see that nothing shows up, right? I'm not able to use Amazon as an iframe, and that's because they have some setting toggled where they don't allow their website to be used as an iframe. And kind of for good reason. I mean, one of the problems or one of the dangers of iframes is that someone else's website could pose as another person's website. So I could create a website and just have an iframe of Amazon's website in my website, and I could trick people into going to my website, and they would just think it's Amazon, right? So they'd be like, oh, I'm on Amazon, this is cool. Meanwhile, they're on my website, and I could like take their data or, do something malicious to them. So that's one reason why people wouldn't want to have iframes. And it kind of makes sense. But in my case, like for draftacademy.com, like I have no problem letting people iframe that. So it's available to me. So yeah, that's the basics of iframes. Like I said, you can resize them, you can move them around, and they can be a really useful feature in your website. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about meta tags in HTML. So up here in the head of my website, you'll see that I have this meta tag right here, and this is normally a meta tag that's included in most HTML, and it's specifying the char set of my file, right? The character set. But in addition to this meta tag, we can also define other meta tags, and meta tags live in the head of the HTML file, and the head is basically just used to like define information about the file or do some different like configuration with the file. And these meta tags are used for metadata. So metadata is like data about data. So we can use meta tags to define information about this particular web page. I'm going to show you some of those different meta tags, and we'll talk about like how they're used and why they're useful. So I'm going to make a new meta tag, and we're going to call this one name. So we're going to give it a name, and we're going to call it description. So this is going to be the like full-on description of our website. And over here, I'm just going to type content. So this is going to be the content of the meta tag. And here you could type like your description. And most websites are going to have a description, and this is something that can be used by, for example, a search engine in order to kind of like help to figure out what your website's about. So if you give a good description of what your website's doing, then a search engine could use that information to kind of figure out where your page should sit in like page rankings and stuff like that. And a general rule, people usually would say like maybe 160 characters for a description is like kind of good. You don't want the description to be too long. Like if the description's over like let's say 200 characters, then most search engines are just kind of gonna ignore it, or they might even like penalize you for that in like your search ranking. So description is very important. Just make sure you keep it brief. Another meta tag that we can use is for the author. So I can say meta name, and this is gonna be author. And actually, I don't think I closed this tag, yeah. So you can just close all of these like this. And then again, we can just define the content. So this is going to define like the or who the author is. So like in our case, it's me. And we can also define some keywords. So this is going to be keywords, and again, content. So the keywords can just be stored in like a comma separated list. So you could say like HTML, tutorial, Draft Academy, stuff like that. So we're just defining this long list of keywords. And again, like the search engine could use those keywords to kind of help index your site. Now, one of the things with this keywords tag is like back in the day, a lot of people would just like shove a bunch of keywords inside of there, and then their pages would get like ranked on Google or Yahoo like artificially. So like all these pages would get ranked. Meanwhile, they had nothing to do with the keywords that were in the keyword tag. So I think probably most search engines at this point just don't even like bother looking at the keywords tag, but it can be good to have in there just in case. And another meta tag that we can use, and this one's actually really important, and this controls how your website is displayed on different devices. So we can say name, and it's just called a viewport. And this has a couple complicated little options here that we can configure. So we can just say content, and you want to type out basically just this. So it's going to be width. We're defining the width, and device width, and then initial scale is equal to 1.0. So this is something that you might see in like HTML files if you're looking at them. And basically what this does is it controls how your website is displayed on different devices. So if you didn't have this in here and you went to look at your website on like a mobile device, then the website would just display as it would on a desktop. So it would display like really zoomed out and really far away. And a lot of times people will design their websites to look really good on mobile. So like if you design this website to look really good on a mobile device, if you didn't include this line up in here, then it's possible that the mobile device wouldn't display the website in that mobile view. It would display it like it would on a desktop, so like really zoomed out, and it just wouldn't look good. So defining like the width as the device width, so the current device that's looking at it, allows the HTML to kind of like respond to the size of the screen. So this is another important meta tag. So these are some basic meta tags that you can use inside your website, and there's a couple more. You could just do a Google search and kind of find like all of the possible meta tags, but I would say these like 4 or 5 meta tags are like the most commonly used and the most important for your website. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe.